What if everything you've been taught about human history is a carefully constructed lie? What if the orderly progression from primitive cave dwellers to modern civilization never happened the way they told you? What if instead, just 200 years ago, a catastrophe so devastating occurred that it wiped out an advanced global civilization, buried entire cities under meters of mud, and forced the survivors to start over from almost nothing? This isn't science fiction. This isn't conspiracy theory. This is a conclusion drawn from examining the physical evidence that surrounds us every single day. Evidence that official history cannot explain. Evidence that points to one inescapable truth. We are not the pinnacle of human achievement. We are the descendants of survivors, living in the ruins of a world we don't understand, inheriting a history that was deliberately rewritten to hide the truth about what really happened. Our investigation begins not in ancient texts or secret archives, but in the most mundane place imaginable, in the streets beneath your feet. Walk through any historic city centre in the world. St. Petersburg, Paris, Rome, New York, Buenos Aires. Look down at the buildings around you, and you'll notice something deeply strange. The windows of what should be the first floor are halfway, sometimes completely, buried underground. You'll see elegant arched windows with their sills 3, 4, sometimes 5 meters below street level. You'll find ornate doorways that now open into solid earth. Grand entrances that lead nowhere. Official history offers you a simple explanation. The cultural layer. Over centuries, they say, dirt accumulated. People tracked in mud. Garbage piled up. The streets gradually rose higher and higher until the original ground floor became a basement. It sounds plausible until you actually think about it for more than 30 seconds. 5 meters of accumulated dirt is the height of a 1.5-story building. Are we really supposed to believe that for hundreds of years, entire civilizations across the globe simply lived in their own filth, never once thinking to clean the streets, to haul away the garbage, to maintain the original ground level? What, are we supposed to believe that architects deliberately designed beautiful, expensive ground floor windows, knowing they would be underground in a century? When these buried floors are excavated, we find something that destroys the cultural layer theory completely. These aren't basements, they're full, finished first floors, complete with windows, doorways, decorative elements, sometimes even balconies. Everything a ground floor should have. But they were buried fast. Buried by something that covered entire cities across the planet in a matter of days, perhaps hours. The evidence is overwhelming. In city after city, continent after continent, we see the same pattern. Buildings designed for one ground level, now sitting on another, with an entire floor entombed beneath the earth. This is not a slow accumulation. This is a catastrophe. A global event that geologists and researchers have started calling the mud flood. But what could cause such devastation? What force could bury cities from Siberia to Argentina under meters of clay and sediment? Let's travel to America in the late 1800s, to Seattle and Kansas City. 2 cities separated by thousands of miles, but united by an impossible mystery. In old photographs from this era, we see something that shouldn't exist. We see massive earthen hills, vertical cliffs of compacted soil, rising in the middle of urban areas. Buildings sit at the base of these hills like archaeological ruins freshly unearthed. In some images, houses perch precariously on top of these mounds of earth, tilting as if about to slide into the chasm below. Official history tells us this was just terrain, natural topography that needed to be levelled for city development. But look closer at the photographs. Look at what they're doing to remove this soil. We see steam-powered excavators working day and night. We see entire railway systems built on temporary tracks just to haul the dirt away. We see something else, something stranger. We see crews spraying these earthen walls with powerful jets of water, washing the soil away in streams. Why water? Turning tons of earth into mud is extraordinarily inefficient. It makes the work harder, not easier. It complicates transportation and creates a mess. Unless, of course, the earth wasn't actually earth at all. Unless it was something else. Something frozen. The official name for these formations in Seattle is revealing. They were called glacial hills. At first glance, this seems like a geological term describing ancient glacial deposits. But what if we take it literally? What if these hills were actually frozen when they were found? Look at how gold miners in Alaska dealt with permafrost. They couldn't dig through it with shovels. The ground was hard as concrete, so they used the same technique we see in Seattle. Powerful jets of water to thaw the frozen mass, turning it into slurry that could be washed away. The hypothesis becomes clear. Relatively recently, perhaps only 150 to 200 years ago, a massive wave of ice, mud, and debris swept across coastal regions. A tsunami, but not of water, of ice. Billions of tons of frozen slush from the ocean floor, mixed with pulverized rock, soil, and the shattered remains of everything in its path. This wave crashed onto the land, covering cities, forests, everything, and then froze solid in place, creating what would later be called glacial hills. But this theory, as compelling as it is, has a fatal flaw. It explains Seattle perfectly, but it cannot explain Kansas City. Kansas City sits nearly 900 feet above sea level, thousands of miles from any ocean. No tsunami, no matter how massive, could reach it, yet the buildings there were buried even deeper. 23 feet of soil covering structures up to their second floor windows. The same phenomenon, but in the heart of the continent where water could never have been the cause. So if not water, then what? Look at the early photographs of Kansas City during excavation. The terrain isn't flat, it's undulating, rippled, like frozen waves or massive sand dunes. This doesn't look like mud settled by water. It looks like material deposited by wind, by dust storms of apocalyptic scale. We have modern examples of what this looks like. In northern Russia, there's a village being swallowed by a desert. Sand pours through windows, buries houses up to their roofs, covers streets entirely. This is the slow version. Now imagine this process accelerated 1,000,000 times. Imagine storms so vast, so powerful, that they stripped the topsoil from entire regions and deposited it hundreds of miles away in dunes that covered cities whole. The evidence forces us to accept something incredible. The catastrophe wasn't uniform. It wasn't a single event with a single cause. Depending on geography and elevation, different regions suffered different fates. Coastal areas were hit by ice tsunamis. Interior continents were buried by dust storms that raged for years. Some places were struck by both. This was a planetary scale disaster. Something happened that fundamentally broke the Earth's climate system. And the evidence suggests it happened very, very recently. But if cities around the world were buried under meters of sediment, what about the people who lived in them? Where did they go? And more importantly, if they disappeared, where did we come from? The answer is hidden in plain sight, in the oldest photographs we have. When photography was invented in the 1840s, cameras captured something that shouldn't have been possible. They captured cities, magnificent cities, with paved streets and complex architecture standing completely empty. Paris, St. Petersburg, Moscow, New York. Daguerreotypes from the 1850s and 60s show urban centres that look like movie sets before the actors arrive. grand boulevards devoid of traffic, magnificent plazas without a single person. The official explanation is laughable. They claim the long exposure times of early cameras simply didn't capture moving objects, so people disappeared from the frame. But this is a lie that can be disproven by anyone with basic knowledge of physics. If exposures were so long that moving people vanished, then why are the shadows sharp? Why is the water in rivers frozen in time, not a misty blur? Why are tree branches clear, not smeared by the wind? Why don't we see any stationary objects? No parked carriages, no street vendors' carts that would have stayed in one place for hours. The truth is simpler and far more disturbing. The cities were empty because they were empty. These photographs captured the moment after the cleanup, but before the resettlement, before the arrival of the new inhabitants, before us. Now look at what happens next in the historical record. Suddenly, within a few decades of these empty city photographs, we see a demographic explosion. The population growth charts show something that defies natural explanation. For thousands of years, human population is a nearly flat line. Then suddenly, in the mid-1800s, there's a vertical spike. Official science credits medicine and industry. But there's another explanation, one that accounts for all the evidence. This wasn't population growth. This was population placement. And here's where the evidence becomes undeniable. In the 19th century, millions of orphans appear. Not hundreds, not thousands, millions. All across Europe, Russia and America, enormous institutions spring up seemingly overnight to house them. Foundling homes designed for tens of thousands of children. In America alone, a program called the Orphan Trains transports over 200,000 children from East Coast cities to the frontier, where they're distributed to farms and towns as free labour. Where did these children come from? Official history mumbles about wars, epidemics, industrial accidents. But none of these explanations account for the sheer scale. This was a global phenomenon. A tidal wave of parentless children appearing simultaneously on every continent. The only explanation that fits all the facts is this. These children were the first generation. They were raised in institutions, given new identities, taught a simplified history, and sent out to populate the empty cities left behind after the catastrophe. We are not looking at orphans in the traditional sense. We are looking at the planned resettlement of a depopulated planet. This is why, for most people on Earth, family history disappears somewhere in the mid to late 1800s. This is why genealogical research hits a wall around that time. The records don't exist because we weren't here before. Then, our civilization is less than 200 years old. Everything before that, everything we call history, is either fabricated or it belongs to someone else. But who were they? Who built these cities we inherited? Every piece of evidence points to the same conclusion. The buildings we attribute to our recent ancestors were designed for people or beings of a completely different scale. Walk into any old bank, theatre, or government building constructed before 1900. The doors are massive, often 15 to 20 feet tall. The handles are positioned at face level or higher for an average person. The ceilings soar to heights of 30, 40, sometimes 50 feet in a single room. The windows start above head height and extend upward to impossible dimensions. The staircases have steps that are awkwardly tall and deep, making them uncomfortable to climb. From an engineering standpoint, this makes no sense. Heating such spaces in winter would require enormous amounts of fuel. The materials needed to construct such oversized architecture would be wasteful and expensive. There's no practical reason to build this way unless the intended occupants were much, much larger than we are. And the evidence for giants is overwhelming when you start looking. Museums around the world are filled with objects that modern humans simply cannot use. Books so large and heavy they cannot be held while reading. Musical instruments, organs, double basses, saxophones, whose dimensions require a lung capacity and finger span we do not possess. Weapons, two-handed swords that would be impossible to wield effectively at human height. Armour and helmets sized for being 7, 8 or 9 feet tall. Crowns and rings that would fall off a normal person's head and fingers. Historical records mention them constantly. Chronicles from the 16th and 17th centuries casually reference the discovery of skeletons 6, 7, even 11 metres in length. Herodotus, Pliny the Elder. Medieval map makers all described and mapped the territories of giant races. The famous Hereford and Ebstorf maps don't place these beings in mythical lands. They place them in Scandinavia, in Northern Europe, right next door to normal human populations. Even the language we use preserves the memory. Terms like Your Highness didn't originally refer to social status. They referred to physical height. The aristocracy, the ruling class, were called this because they were literally taller, physically larger than the common people. The architecture confirms it. The centres of ancient European cities feature buildings whose proportions, ceiling heights, and doorways are calculated for beings approximately 3.5 metres tall. These are what researchers call the Atlanteans. They coexisted with humans, judging by the infrastructure that remains intact. But there's an older layer. Structures like the Roman baths feature doorways designed for beings up to 15 metres in height. These are the true Titans. Their disappearance is linked directly to the catastrophe we've been discussing, to what ancient texts call the war and the flood. So we're faced with an unavoidable conclusion. The world was built by giants. They possess technology that we don't understand and can't replicate. They created the infrastructure, the buildings, the cities. And then something happened. Something catastrophic. And when the survivors emerged from the ruins, the giants were gone. The cities were buried, and a new, smaller humanity was brought in to inhabit what remained. But the technology of the previous world didn't completely disappear. Some of it was still functioning when we arrived. And this is where the mystery deepens even further. Look at the great palaces of Europe. Versailles, Peterhof, the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. These places feature fountain systems that are engineering marvels. At Peterhof, water is collected from sources dozens of kilometres away and delivered through a complex network of channels and cast iron pipes. The system uses gravity alone, no pumps, to create jets of water that shoot 20 metres into the air. The pressure calculations, the metallurgy of the pipes, the precision of the gradients. This is advanced industrial technology. Yet the same palaces that boast these hydraulic masterpieces lack the most basic sanitation. There are no bathrooms, no toilets, no sewage systems. Historical accounts tell us that the nobility used chamber pots and relieved themselves behind curtains, with the contents thrown out windows. The halls reeked. Perfume was invented not for seduction, but to mask the stench of human waste. This contradiction is impossible. You cannot possess the knowledge to engineer complex hydraulic systems and simultaneously be unable to install basic plumbing. Unless, of course, the people living in the palaces weren't the ones who built the fountains. The hydraulic systems were already there, functioning, when the new inhabitants arrived. These new occupants, our ancestors, understood that the fountains worked. They could see the water flowing, could demonstrate them as symbols of their authority, but they didn't understand how they worked. They had no access to the technical floors where the controls and mechanisms were located, because those floors were buried under the mud flood. All the infrastructure, the water supply, the sewage, the heating, everything was on the lower technical levels that were now inaccessible, filled with compacted clay and debris. So the new residents did what they could. They installed crude fireplaces in rooms that were never designed for them. Small, decorative fireplaces that couldn't possibly heat the enormous spaces. They lived in the upper floors, turning what were probably second or third stories into new ground levels, and they adapted badly. This is why there's such a gap between the external beauty of these palaces and the primitive conditions. Inside, they're using buildings they don't understand, built by people they can't remember, for purposes they never fully grasped. And this pattern repeats with other structures, especially with what we call churches and cathedrals. These buildings, found in identical form from Argentina to Russia, from Australia to Alaska, share a suspicious set of features. They all have massive domes. They all have tall spires topped with complex metal structures. They all have elaborate rose windows with geometric patterns. From an engineering perspective, these aren't religious symbols. They're components of a technical system. The domes are perfect resonators and energy concentrators. The spires are antennae, designed to capture atmospheric electricity. The ornate metal crosses at their peaks aren't crosses in the Christian sense. They're multi-beam wave terminals, discharge points for electrical energy. The rose windows could modulate frequencies. What we've been told our houses of worship were actually power stations, generators of free wireless energy drawn from the atmosphere itself. The enormous open spaces inside weren't for congregations. They were for housing equipment, or simply for creating the resonant spaces needed for the technology to function. The evidence suggests that at one time there was a global grid, a network of these structures providing clean, unlimited energy to the entire planet. This is why we see, in early photographs from the 1890s, cities lit by electricity. Streetcars running on electric motors with no overhead wires. Electric vehicles on the streets of Buenos Aires, Pittsburgh, even remote Texas towns. Then something changed. Within just a few years, all of it vanished. By the early 1900s, those same streets are full of horses and mud. The electric trams are gone. The lights are out. Technology regressed by half a century in the span of a decade. This was the Great Shutdown. At some point, the global energy network was deliberately turned off. The power stations, which we now call churches, were decommissioned, and humanity was forced to develop a new system, one based on centralized coal and oil plants, one that required wires, meters, and most importantly, payment. Free energy grants independence. Metered energy creates control. To consolidate this control, to appropriate the infrastructure of the previous civilization as their own, the new powers needed to erase any memory of what came before. They needed to rewrite history, and they did. The method was systematic. First, fire. Across the 19th century, a suspicious wave of great fires swept the globe. Moscow in 1812, Chicago, Boston, San Francisco. Official explanations blame accidents, a fallen candle, a cow kicking over a lamp. But the photographs show cities built of stone and brick, burned so completely that granite blocks crumbled to sand. These weren't accidental fires. These were controlled demolitions of evidence. And what burned most reliably? Archives, libraries, city records, patent offices, anything that contained documentation of the previous world, of its technology, of its true timeline. Second, spectacle. The world's fairs of the late 1800s and early 1900s are perhaps the most brazen part of the deception. Official history claims that for these events, massive temporary cities were built in a year or two from plaster and wood. Buildings with domes, colonnades, electric lighting, and complex water features, all constructed from a material called staff, basically straw and glue. And after a few months, all of it was demolished, destroyed, erased. But the photographs prove this is a lie. these weren't temporary structures. They were real buildings, stone and brick, excavated from the buried previous world. They were cleaned, restored, filled with electricity that was likely their original power source, and displayed to the public as a wonder of modern engineering. People were shown moving sidewalks, wireless energy, advanced acoustic systems, all presented as temporary attractions, fantasies, and then they were blown up, deliberately destroyed because they were too perfect. They revealed a level of technology that couldn't be explained by steam engines and manual labour. So after the fairs closed, these structures were dynamited, their rubble dumped into rivers and bays to create new waterfront land, and the truth was buried forever. This is how they did it. They destroyed the physical evidence, and they rewrote the narrative. They gave us a story of slow, steady progress from caves to civilization. They convinced us that we built everything we see around us, that we're the pinnacle of human development. But we're not. We're the descendants of an artificially created generation. We're living in the ruins of a far more advanced civilization, convinced that these ruins are our own achievements. The evidence is everywhere once you know how to look. The buried first floors, the empty cities in early, photographs, the millions of orphans, the architecture designed for giants, the advanced hydraulic systems paired with primitive living conditions, the global network of identical power stations we now call churches, the technological regression from electricity to horses, the suspicious fires, the disposable World's Fairs. Every single piece points to the same truth. Around the year 1800, something happened. A catastrophe of planetary scale, ice tsunamis, dust storms, perhaps weapons we can't comprehend. The vapour canopy that had protected the Earth collapsed. Atmospheric pressure dropped. The giants, who depended on that denser atmosphere, began to die out. The cities were buried, the population was nearly wiped out, and in the aftermath, a new order took control. They found empty cities, advanced infrastructure they barely understood, and a handful of survivors. They brought in or created a new generation. They raised millions of children in institutions, gave them simple identities, taught them a sanitized history. They sent these orphans out to populate the ruins. They told them, this is yours. Your ancestors built this. But it was a lie that has persisted for less than 200 years, but has been so thoroughly embedded that we can't see the truth even when it's carved in stone right in front of us. We are not the builders. We are the inheritors. We are the descendants of a reset generation, living in a world we don't fully understand, using technology we didn't create, following a history that was written to control us. This is why our family trees end in the 1800s. This is why we have such fragmentary records before that time. This is why the architecture doesn't match the supposed technology of the era. This is why the scale of everything is wrong. This is why there are so many contradictions that official history can't explain. We are the survivors of the Great Reset, and everything we've been taught about who we are and where we came from is designed to keep us from asking the most important question of all. What really happened? And who is hiding the truth? The stones can't lie. The buried buildings can't lie. The empty cities in those first photographs can't lie. The millions of orphans who appeared from nowhere can't lie. The evidence is absolute and overwhelming. We are not who we think we are. And perhaps, just perhaps, it's time we started remembering.